It was supposed to be another routine late-night interview, another round of political jabs and smug punchlines. But when Kash Patel walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, no one could have predicted what would unfold. Within minutes, tension crackled, like static in the air, and by the end, security had to intervene. What did Patel say that left the audience speechless? Why did Kimmel lose control of his own show? And how did this explosive encounter end in total chaos? Make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss a single second of what really happened behind the scenes. The lights burned a little brighter that night. Maybe it was the heat of the stage, or maybe it was something unspoken in the air. When Kash Patel walked onto the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, the audience offered polite applause, but the energy was off. From the very first step he took past the velvet curtain, eyes narrowed, expressions stiffened, and a strange silence threaded through the room. Why had Patel agreed to this interview in the first place? A former official turned outspoken critic of Hollywood and its political echo chamber, he was never shy about voicing opinions that cut against the grain. And Jimmy Kimmel, the late-night host known for sharp jabs cloaked in comedy, had invited him for what the producers promised would be a light conversation. But when had any of these shows ever been light when it came to politics? As Patel took his seat, he didn't even lean back. His posture was firm, his expression measured. Kimmel smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. They exchanged pleasantries, yes, but even those were wrapped in tension. It wasn't long before the mask dropped. "So, Kash," Kimmel began with a smirk, "you've been making the rounds lately, stirring up conspiracy talk and throwing stones at people who actually read books." The crowd laughed, some nervously, others with an edge of malice. Patel didn't flinch. "That's rich, coming from a guy who hides behind a script and a studio audience," he replied calmly. "You invite people like me here so you can mock them in front of your fans. But I think people are tired of the show. Was that scripted? Was this entire appearance a setup from the beginning?" Patel's words weren't bombastic. They were precise, almost surgical. Kimmel blinked, leaned forward, and replied in a tone laced with sarcasm. "Oh, I forgot. You're the brave truth-teller, right? Sitting there pretending to be the victim of a Hollywood talk show? Come on, Kash. No one's buying that act." But Patel wasn't playing a role. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not the victim here," he said. "The victim is the truth. And you've helped kill it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kimmel's face froze, unsure whether to laugh or lash out. For a second it felt like the stage had shrunk. The flashy graphics, the polished camera pans, the rehearsed charm, none of it could mask the fact that this moment had gone off script. What happens when the host of the show loses control? What does a network do when the guest refuses to play along? And how far will someone go to stop a narrative they cannot shape? The tension escalated quickly. Kimmel tried to steer things back to comedy, launching into a prepared joke about Patel's tinfoil fan base. But by then, the tone had shifted completely. It was no longer funny, and Patel made sure of it. "You keep calling people crazy because it is easier than listening," Patel said sharply. "You laugh, but you never answer. And you invite guests just to humiliate them. Why?" That was the question that hung in the air like smoke. Why did he invite him? Why was this even happening on live television? For all of Kimmel's political grandstanding, this was something different. This wasn't a shouting match. This wasn't a meltdown. It was a dismantling, and it was happening slowly, painfully, right in front of the cameras. In the control room, producers were already exchanging frantic glances. Studio staff were tense. Security near the wings shifted positions. The audience didn't know whether to clap, boo, or stay silent. Something real was breaking through the surface, and no one, not even Kimmel, seemed ready to stop it. And then, just as the commercial break was supposed to roll in, Patel said something that forced the show into chaos. The stage, once a playground for punchlines, had become something else entirely. Kash Patel, still seated and composed, delivered the line that broke the room. "You can laugh all you want, Jimmy, but when comedians become the gatekeepers of political discourse, the joke's on the country." There was no laughter after that, not even an awkward chuckle. The silence that followed was thick, almost aggressive. Kimmel, who had made a career of slicing through discomfort with charm, seemed frozen. His jaw tightened as he looked out toward the audience, then back at Patel. "Are you seriously lecturing me about politics?" Kimmel snapped, his voice now tinged with real anger. "You, of all people?" The crowd stirred uneasily. The playful tension had collapsed into raw confrontation, and suddenly, it no longer felt like a talk show. It felt like a courtroom, or maybe a battleground. Patel leaned in slightly, his tone still calm, still precise. "You invited me," he said. "If you thought I'd come here to play your game, that's on you. I came to say what people are afraid to say, especially in rooms like this." Kimmel shot a glance toward the producer's booth, an unspoken plea for direction. But there was no lifeline coming. The show was live. The audience, both in studio and at home, was watching something slip beyond the usual boundaries. No laugh. Track could cover this. He stood up, abruptly. "Not Patel. Kimmel." "All right," he barked, motioning toward the crew. "Let's take a break." But Patel wasn't done. He stayed in his seat, eyes steady on the host. "A break? Is that how it works when you're losing control?" That comment stopped Kimmel in his tracks. He turned slowly, the frustration now barely concealed. "No, that's how it works when someone hijacks a comedy show to push their paranoid crusade." "And yet here we are," Patel replied. "You brought me on. You knew exactly who I was and what I'd say. You wanted a spectacle. Now you have one." The camera panned away, but the microphones were still hot. In the background, staff members were scrambling. The teleprompter had frozen, and the timing was off. No one was laughing. No one knew what came next. The wall between reality and performance had collapsed, and the result was more gripping than any monologue Kimmel had ever rehearsed. Security approached the edge of the stage. They weren't storming in, not yet, but their presence was now impossible to ignore. In that moment, Kimmel faced a choice: de-escalate or double down. He chose the latter. "You come on my show, insult my team, insult my audience, and expect—" "What? A standing ovation?" he snapped. "You are the worst kind of guest. A guy who thinks being controversial is the same as being right." Patel stood now, not with anger but resolve. "No," he said. "I'm not here to be right. I'm here to be heard. And clearly, that's the biggest threat to people like you." That was the moment the line was crossed. Kimmel, flushed with fury, turned to the crew and gave the signal. "Get him off my stage!" A collective gasp swept through the audience. Security moved in. Not violently, but with purpose. Two men flanked Patel, who didn't resist, didn't shout, didn't even flinch. He simply looked at Kimmel and said one final thing before the microphones cut off. "This is who you are when the script runs out." As they walked him off stage, the audience didn't cheer. Some were stunned into silence. Others looked to Kimmel, expecting a quip to break the tension. But he had none. His face was a portrait of a man who realized, too late, that the narrative had slipped from his hands. In the control room, the lead producer cursed under his breath. Network phones lit, up within seconds. And somewhere in the green room hallway, Patel's team watched a monitor go dark, but the fallout hadn't even begun. The backstage hallway felt like it belonged to another world. Gone were the bright lights and playful graphics. Here, the walls were silent, the floor cold, the air thick with disbelief. Kash Patel walked between two security guards without resistance, his expression unreadable. Behind him, murmurs buzzed from the crew like static, half shocked, half intrigued. No one dared say it out loud, but the question hung in every eye. What just happened? As Patel was escorted through the service corridor, he glanced toward a small television mounted in the corner. It showed the studio feed on a slight delay. On screen, Jimmy Kimmel had returned to the stage, sitting alone. No audience laughter, no music, no momentum. Just a man trying to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers. "I want to apologize," Kimmel finally said, looking straight into the camera. "That wasn't what this show is about. That guest, he was not honest about his intentions. It was a weak attempt to reclaim the upper hand." But even Kimmel knew, his tone gave him away, that the apology was not for what happened. It was for how little power he had to stop it. Back in the green room, Patel's team was already fielding calls. News outlets had picked up the story within minutes. Social media clips were multiplying. Some viewers were calling it an ambush. Others called it courage. Either way, the fallout was immediate, and it was bigger than either man had anticipated. Patel, now in the parking lot, pulled out his phone. Messages poured in from journalists, podcasters, political allies, and critics alike. His team asked him if he wanted to release a statement. He shook his head. "No need," he said quietly. The cameras were already rolling. At the same time, Kimmel retreated to his dressing room, the door slamming shut behind him. Inside, he stared into the mirror for a long time. The facade had cracked on live television, and nothing, not clever editing, not a follow-up monologue, could erase it. Network executives were already calling an emergency meeting. The situation had escalated past the realm of late-night entertainment. Sponsors were anxious. Affiliates were demanding clarification. Publicists were scrambling to frame the night as a miscommunication, a one-time lapse. But the footage told a different story. There was no shouting match, no tantrum, no broken mic stand, just a man calmly saying things no one wanted to hear, on a platform that was never meant for honesty. And that was the real threat. By morning, the headlines were inescapable. Kash Patel removed from set after explosive interview. Kimmel erupts. On guest over political clash, and late-night talk or censorship theater. The narrative fractured. Some said Patel had sabotaged the show. Others claimed Kimmel exposed his own bias. But no one could deny that something real had happened. Inside the network offices, the PR team debated whether to air the full uncut footage. They feared backlash, but cutting it would only stoke more suspicion. For years, late-night shows had operated as carefully curated performances, blending satire and spin under the banner of comedy. But this wasn't satire. And it wasn't funny. That night, Patel released a short clip on his social media. It showed only his final moment on stage, as he turned to Kimmel and said, "This is who you are when the script runs out." The clip went viral in hours. Millions viewed it. Comment sections exploded with debate. Something had pierced the surface. And while Kimmel tried to recover, planning a full explanation in his next opening monologue, the damage was already done. He wasn't just a host anymore. He had become the face of a system exposed in real time. But Patel wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The morning after the on-air explosion felt less like the aftermath of a scandal, and more like the first wave of a reckoning. Kash Patel woke up to find his name not just trending, but dominating every platform. News outlets on both sides of the political spectrum had already spun their versions of the clash, but beneath the surface-level coverage, a deeper conversation had begun to take shape. One about control, gatekeeping, and the cost of speaking freely in a space designed for applause, not pushback. Meanwhile, the network scrambled. Executives, legal teams, and marketing heads met in back-to-back crisis calls. Some argued to bury the unedited footage. Others warned that suppression would only add fuel to Patel's growing fire. Ratings from the previous night were through the roof, but the tone had shifted. Viewers were no longer watching for comedy. They were watching for fractures. Inside the writer's room, Jimmy Kimmel sat silently while his team threw out lines for the upcoming show. But nothing stuck. Every joke felt hollow, every punchline forced. Eventually, Kimmel stood, pushing the note cards away. "This isn't something we can joke about," he said, his voice low and tired. He wasn't wrong. The public reaction had already outpaced the spin machine. What disturbed the media gatekeepers wasn't that Patel had challenged Kimmel. It was that he had done so calmly without theatrics. No yelling, no meltdown. Just facts, wrapped in questions no one dared answer. Back in Washington, political operatives took note. Lawmakers who had dismissed Patel as a fringe figure now watched with sharpened curiosity. His visibility had shifted. He was no longer simply a background character in someone else's narrative. He had become the story. At a press conference scheduled originally for a separate matter, one journalist broke rank. "Mr. Patel," she asked from the second row, "do you think your removal from the show proves a kind of ideological censorship?" Patel, flanked by his advisors, didn't blink. "I think it proves what happens when someone challenges the illusion of free dialogue on a platform that depends on applause to survive," he answered. "What we witnessed was not a disagreement. It was exposure." His words ignited a fresh wave of commentary. Suddenly, late-night shows were under a different kind of scrutiny. Commentators began digging into past segments, old interviews, moments when guests were steered away from uncomfortable truths with laughter or commercial breaks. And while Kimmel's team tried to prepare a redemption arc, they couldn't control what happened next. The raw, unedited footage was leaked. No one knew who released it. Some suspected a whistleblower inside the network. Others believed someone in Patel's camp had recorded a parallel feed. But there it was, 19 uninterrupted minutes of footage that showed every second of the confrontation. From Patel's opening remarks to Kimmel's decision to cut to break, to the off-camera moment when security approached the stage. What stunned viewers most was what happened right before the cameras officially stopped rolling. Kimmel, voice just barely audible, muttered, "We should have never booked him." That line struck harder than anything said during the broadcast. It confirmed what many suspected, that the invitation had not been an act of intellectual openness, but a miscalculated attempt to control a narrative that ultimately backfired. The fallout was swift. Media watchdogs demanded explanations. Late night, critics penned think pieces with headlines like "Comedy in Crisis" and "When the Monologue Meets Its Match." Sponsors pulled out. Advertisers requested guarantees that future guests would not jeopardize the tone of the program. And Patel? He booked 3 interviews in one day, not with entertainment shows, but with long-form political forums, places where no one held the mute button. In one of those interviews, when asked whether he would appear on Kimmel's show again, if invited, Patel smiled. "Only if he agrees to no script. Just us. Face to face." The offer was more than rhetorical. It was a challenge, one that cut deeper than any political jab. A challenge to meet in a space without pretense, without handlers, without safety nets. And now, the ball was in Kimmel's court. The air in the Kimmel studio had grown quieter in the days following the broadcast, but not in a peaceful way. It was the silence that follows upheaval, the kind that lingers after the stage lights have dimmed and the audience has stopped clapping. Inside the production offices, every meeting carried tension. The questions were no longer about punchlines, but about damage. Could the show bounce back? Should it even try? Meanwhile, Kash Patel surged forward with unexpected momentum. Once a behind-the-scenes figure, he now found himself at the center of a cultural moment no one could ignore. His interviews amassed millions of views. Public appearances were standing room only. And what made him even more dangerous to the establishment was the one thing no one anticipated. He was not asking for forgiveness. He wasn't backpedaling. He wasn't playing into outrage or victimhood. He was simply repeating what he had already said, again and again, until the repetition itself became irrefutable. In response to the leaked footage, Kimmel's producers released an official statement claiming the decision to cut the interview had nothing to do with politics, but rather a concern for tone and audience expectations. But that only fueled more backlash. What exactly did audience expectations mean? And who decided what viewers were allowed to hear? The public demanded a response, and so, under pressure from both critics and loyal fans, Kimmel addressed the controversy on air. He stood center stage, no band playing, no laughter track, just a long, quiet pause before he began. I've always believed in comedy as a way to say the things people are afraid to say. But last week, I let my discomfort speak louder than my principles. The audience stayed silent. No cheers, no interruptions. Kimmel continued, Kash Patel came on this show with a purpose. I thought I was ready for it. I wasn't. And maybe that's on me. It was as close to an apology as he could offer. And though it came too late for some, it landed differently for others. The footage was already out there. The damage had been done. But the acknowledgement, however delayed, reopened a conversation, rather than closing one. Later that evening, Patel responded in his own way, not through a tweet, not through a press release, but through a live event streamed from a packed auditorium. On stage, he stood before a crowd that had grown beyond political allies. It was filled with students, skeptics, veterans, journalists, and everyday citizens who had simply tuned in that night expecting comedy and were instead confronted with something much more honest. Here's the truth, Patel said into the mic. I wasn't kicked off that stage because I was rude, or because I shouted, or because I made it personal. I was kicked off because I stayed calm. I told the truth in a place that isn't used to hearing it. The room was silent, leaning forward. And if a comedy show can't handle that, what does that say about the state of our dialogue as a country? The audience erupted, not in hysteria but in understanding. It wasn't about Jimmy Kimmel anymore. It wasn't about Patel either. It was about the invisible wall between what people know and what they are allowed to say out loud. What began as a segment meant to elicit laughs had become something far more disruptive. A moment that pulled back the curtain on the performance of discourse itself. And while Hollywood scrambled to preserve its image, and pundits tried to tame the chaos into narratives that fit neatly into political boxes, something else had already taken root. People were listening again. Not to sound bites, not to scripts, but to real moments, unfiltered, unedited, unapologetic. In the end, Patel did not need to be a hero. He just needed to be honest in a room that wasn't ready for it. And that, more than anything, is what made the nation watch.